My name is John Malkin, and this is Transformation Highway. This is KZSC 88.1 FM, kzsc.org, broadcasting from the University of California, Santa Cruz. You're listening to an interview with Robert Dilts and Michael Hall, authors and longtime instructors of NeuroLinguistic Programming. Here now is Robert Dilts.
My basic mission, if you will, is to try to help create a world to which people want to belong and in which they can thrive and to which they can contribute. But I think, and that's been a seed that's been there for a long time, actually, ever since my days many decades ago at UC Santa Cruz.
Well, that's a part of what I'd love to hear about, because here I am in Santa Cruz and I went to school here and never left because why leave?
I completely understand. This is similar to me. I mean, I have my house in France, but my other place for the last 50 years has been Santa Cruz. So
tell me, I'd love to hear about the early days of neuro-linguistic programming that happened here at Kresge College at UCSC and your involvement there. Before that, just so people have a general view of NLP, can you talk about what neuro-linguistic programming is for you?
Absolutely. So, it's one of those unfortunate names because it's a bit, complicated, but the idea of neuro-linguistic, it's sort of the nervous system and language or communication and how those interact and produce the sort of programming through which we live. So that notion of programming is that, we develop essentially patterns of behavior, and those patterns of behavior are going to be formed and shaped by the way that we think and the way that we speak, and also not just cognitively, but also, in our somatic, our body, the nervous system goes through the whole body. Also, obviously our nervous systems each interact with each other. So NLP is trying to look at what are some of the dynamics of how that happens. And again, even though the name sounds very complex and esoteric, the reason that NLP is generally known around the world is because it sort of has been able to produce some very pragmatic kinds of tools and resources for people to, communicate better and have better lives. If I have to really shorten my explanation, I always like to say, well, what title of one of my books is Tools for Dreamers. And so I say, that's kind of what NLP is about, is how do you formulate a dream and kind of turn that into some kind of, actual life experience.
You have written a lot of books and done a lot of trainings in neuro-linguistic programming. And I think you have created or combined or condensed different aspects and created models and methods.
Yes.
Would you, and some of your approaches are from a spiritual angle, some are from a neurological angle, psychological. Say a little bit more about some of the tools you've developed over the years, maybe the most beneficial, or if you think of examples.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a great question, John. There's several that I know that are widely used. One of the simple ones is one that simple means in a way is one that's come out of doing kind of modeling. So NLP, another thing about NLP, I suppose I should say, is that the foundation of NLP is what we call behavioral modeling. And what behavioral modeling means is that you find a person or a group, team, a group, or even a whole organization could be, that is doing something that seems to be particularly effective, exceptional, remarkable. and you're asking this question, what's the difference that makes the difference? What are they doing, or how are they approaching it that's different than the way that everyone else has been? And then we're looking at these neuro-linguistic, distinctions, if you will. So one of the ones that I did, I actually, when I was at UCSC, interestingly, I started as an art major. My second year, I switched to a physics major. My third year, I was a politics major. And that's kind of when I got into linguistics and then eventually into neurolinguistics. And actually, I made my own degree, which was called behavioral technology, that kind of combined a bunch of these things that we were talking about, a little bit of spirituality, psychology, technology. So one of the things that I did during that time was I got very intrigued by animation. And so I studied Walt Disney. I remember at UCSC, they had a kind of one of these retrospectives of the sort of history of animation. And I got very intrigued by seeing how Disney really did revolutionize this whole field and kind of turned it into an art form. So I was, wanting to find out, well, how did he do that? Plus, then he made, amusement parks and, other live action films. And anyway, so that one of the things that I was very intrigued about, and I've always been intrigued with, is the whole creative process. And so I looked at, well, how did Disney, how did he manage himself, his teams, his organization to create so many of these, things that are still around today? And sort of the simple version of it was, came across a comment that one of the people who had worked with him for many years said about him, which said, well, there's actually three different Walt Disneys. There's the dreamer, the realist, and the critic. And the question is always, who's coming to your meeting that day? It really intrigued me. And so these would be things that from a neurolinguistic perspective, you're going, oh, what does a dreamer do? What does that mean? And what is a realist? They're different, so sort of different mindsets, if you will. And so I set out to actually, what you would do with NLP is you would try to I watched some videos of him, I read things about him, but try to really get a sense of, because I couldn't actually go and speak to him, obviously, but realized that so dreaming is essentially visualizing. It's using imagination. And in fact, Disney called his creative process Imagineering, which is the combination of imagination and engineering. Using visual imagination. In NLP, we would say, then how do you imagine something? If what do you do to dream? Well, in NLP, one of the things that we look at is things like body posture, eye movements, etc. And so I, developed the system where we said, okay, if you want to dream, you're going to be looking up, you're going to be, your sort of body's going to be open, and then there'll be certain questions that you're thinking of, which is, about the long-term future. Realist is different. A realist is more action-oriented. It's not so much image-oriented. What are you going to do? How will you, what steps will you take? Disney, of course, developed a whole process called storyboarding, where you take something and you chunk it down into bits of actions over time. And then the critic is much more analytical. It's much more verbal. So you kind of have what we call visual, somatic, or kinesthetic, and then verbal. And it's looking for, how does something fit or not fit into certain values? What could go wrong? And just coding that, because so often we have our own inner critics and we encounter critics and all that. But to be able to be clear, okay, there's these three distinct processes. And if you mix them up, a lot of times where people get stuck creatively is they start to dream and immediately the critic comes in, and starts to tear apart the dream, which is easy to do if it's only a dream. But if you start to have a good plan, then the critic becomes actually a good advisor. So that would be one example of something that has been used all over the world by many people. That's the way it's, we were talking about the number of books that I've written, which I think is 30 something now. That's the process, exactly a process I use to write my book. So it's a really pragmatic, creative process. I would say the other thing, John, that this is very relevant to the whole notion of transformation, the thing that I call the levels of change pyramid, which was actually inspired by Gregory Bateson, who was a professor at UCSC, and I took his class on ecology of mind, and he talked about this notion of levels of learning. That was something that really struck me, and I sort of used that as an inspiration for this notion of these different levels of change, where you start on a very pragmatic level. You have environment, so if I want to transform my environment, I've got to do that through behavior. I've got to physically do something to change the environment. But then the question becomes, how do I know what to do behaviorally? So what transforms my behavior? Well, that's going to be my thinking process. And that's where the beginning of sort of neurolinguistics, some sort of strategy, some sort of mental model or mental map. But then beyond that, you have the question of well, why, for which, this is what I would call values and beliefs. Is this? So you have the environment you could characterize as where and when you want to do something. Behavior is what you want to do. Then there's the sort of level, I call it capability level. How are you going to do it? But then there's the belief and values level, which is why are you doing it? What's important? What's the priorities? Then you get up to higher level, sort of the peak of the pyramid is, I would call identity. Who, well, if you answer, sometimes if you're trying to answer these questions, why are you doing it that way? It's because of who you are, what is my role? What is my mission? Mm. And then above that, you have what I would call a spiritual level, which is beyond myself, the fact that I am part of something bigger than me that I serve and that I benefit from, but also it's what gives me meaning. And so so we would say, to have a complete transformation, you're going to sort of have it on all of these different levels. Mm. And in fact, kind of the notion here is that any change I make at these higher levels will necessarily cascade into changes at the other levels. If I change my identity, my values, my priorities are going to change with that. If I change from being in a role, let's say as a teacher, to my role as a parent, my values are going to change. The things capabilities I'm going to use are going to change. Obviously the environment I'm in changes. And so a lot of times when I'm working with people, which I would do either as a coach or a consultant, we're sort of looking at, well, what is the change, the transformation that they want to have in their life? Which level or levels are going to be the most important to, let's say, leverage, if you will, in order to make that happen? And then one of my books is called From Coach to Awakener. And what that book details is, what are some of the tools that you would use to actually, like changing behavior is not the same as changing belief. If changing behavior, you could pretty much use the kind of Skinnerian Pavlovian conditioning. But that kind of conditioning, like for example, you could put somebody like Nelson Mandela in prison for 30 years. You could limit his behavior, but it does not at all change his belief, or his sense of identity or his sense of spiritual purpose. So, what are the dynamics then by which belief changes or identity changes? And that's what a lot of my books are about. So so that's a couple of examples, and hopefully, I know that's a lot. Maybe that's too much, but
not too much, and interesting in a lot of different ways. Hmm. There was a period where I was always asking people about internal and external transformation and the relationship of the two. And the people I'm usually drawn to and interested in are people that are bringing these together in some way. Transformation, liberation, and moving towards, a healthy combination of these.
Yes.
And we do live in paradise. It is really amazing.
Especially if you live in Santa Cruz.
I know. And a lot of
Yeah,
people are struggling. Maybe more than half the world doesn't have enough food every day, and
absolutely.
clean water and
Absolutely.
shoes, um, and we also live in this strange world where a lot of those people who don't have food and shoes, they have an AK-47 somehow.
Right.
That's
Right.
really
Exactly.
bizarre.
It is.
You happen to be going to UCSC maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, mid
Early
70s,
70s. Yeah. Early 70s. Yeah.
early 70s. And I was born in 1963 and
Mm,
grew up with this US war on Vietnam happening. And then
mm,
hearing that World War II had been the last big war and it was the war to end war making.
yeah.
And I've really had this optimistic view that there would at least be much less war happening during my lifetime. And it's not really the case. And I think that you were actively protesting the US war in Vietnam. I don't know if there was a relationship that period of time, 1968 to 1975, there
Mm,
was revolutionary internal and external revolutionary movements happening. What's the relationship of that to NLP?
yeah, well, that's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up because I do think so NLP was born in that period, obviously, and um, NLP came out of UCSC, which was probably the most progressive, certainly the most progressive of the UC schools, maybe the most progressive university to date. I don't know. There was no grades. There was you had evaluations. It was all co-ed. Before that was it was like all revolutionary, and we were all of the age. I mean, I was 18 and draft age, and um, you that was definitely something was on everybody's mind, and wanting to do something about it. And so I think there was this whole sense of revolution. I think another sort of an interesting parallel is that NLP was developing really it's almost the same time that personal computing was developing. So Bandler and Grinder, who were the founders of NLP, were just over the hill from Wozniak and Jobs, who were creating Apple. And this whole idea, and I think this sort of metaphor of big blue, and taking back, the freedom, put the programming is in our hands. It's not in the government's hands, etc. And this was very much, I think even why programming became part of neurolinguistic programming is because it was this place where you could actually, you were in charge. You were not being programmed. You had the ability to be by having the level of awareness and having the support, you could actually be in charge of your own programming rather than your family, your school, your culture, whatever political party was in charge at the time. So there was very much definitely this sense of wanting to take back, the sort of agency, of your life into your own hands, but also wanting to make a difference in the world. Steve Jobs famously saying, I want to make a dent in the universe, so and the other interesting thing, John, it was, and I've talked to my wife about this, who also grew up in San Jose. Her dad was working as I think he was head of technology for IBM, Big Blue at the time, although he was much more radical than the typical Big Blue. Anyway, that there was this feeling that you could do anything. And even Steve Jobs dropped out of college. You didn't have to have a college degree. Basically you had to have passion and a vision and a desire and a will to make a difference, and you could. And it was that was kind of the feeling that we had with NLP. Every new thing that came out, we went, this is going to change the world. This is going to make a difference in the world. And in a way, we were right. NLP is around the world, although there's still, as you point out, a lot of things that are I wish had been changed. But so I think that it was definitely that context, that sense of change the world, take back your choice into your own hands was all very much part of that mindset.
I was watching some videos that are online of you and also of Richard Bandler and John Grinder, and
Mm,
kind of trying to get a better idea of what they were
mm,
all about and where
mm,
neurolinguistic programming came from.
mm,
In
mm.
this one film that you're interviewed in, it's called Altered States.
Oh,
It's about
yes.
Richard Bandler. I don't
Yes.
know what you think of that particular film, but there's a part where Bandler is talking about how he came up with this name, neurolinguistic programming, which
Yeah.
may maybe is a little flippant, that little story
Yeah.
of an encounter with a police officer, but the idea of programming, when I hear that, I feel a little concerned about
Sure.
treating human beings like machines or like computers.
Right.
And so it's really delightful hearing you explain a little more right now that you're kind of coming from the opposite point of view.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
human autonomy and choice and
Yeah.
non-authoritarian. You mentioned B.F. Skinner too just a few minutes ago. And it's
Yes.
funny because I was thinking about Skinner as I'm thinking of talking with you. There was a time I was in my 20s and I read some B.F. Skinner, this book, Walden 2.
Yes. Right.
And I
Right.
happened to be, at the time I was living on this hippie, organic, biodynamic, off the grid farm in Australia of
Yeah.
activists, anti-nuclear activists too.
Wow.
And I read
Fantastic.
this book and I kind of loved the book because it was sort of saying, we can all live together. Here's a
Yeah.
model of it. But then I felt also, and then I explored Skinner more, and he was this control society
Right.
model that is now really what we live inside of, this punishment and reward model,
Exactly.
which I'm
Exactly.
gathering you are outside of.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think, punishment and reward it shapes behavior. It does not create transformation. The deepest part of our identity is something beyond any type of punishment or reward. And you can see that in people who have, I mean, sure, many of the people that we both admire and respect, they're coming from a very different place. They're certainly willing to suffer tremendously, So it's not going to go, oh no, I don't want to do that because it's going to hurt, or something. That I think that's one of those differences that makes the difference, especially when you get up to this very deep level. One of my books is called Tools of the Spirit, and it's sort of about that sense of when you connect to something bigger than yourself. And certainly one of the big dynamics that I work with a lot, especially these days, is the you could call it the balance, the dynamic between ego and soul. And so by ego, I don't necessarily mean Freud. By soul, I don't mean religion, but I mean our ego is that, we are, one part of our reality is that we are a separate, independently thinking, creative individual. The other part of our reality is that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're part of families, communities, professions, and that our meaning comes from the service that we provide. So on the one hand, we need to get and to grow, but we also need to give and to serve. One of my actually one of my favorite, I don't know what you call it, sayings, readings is from the Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, where he said, I slept and I dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and I saw that life was service. I served and I discovered service was joy. So you kind of create this loop. And yeah, so I think to me, really the basic teaching of NLP ultimately is that we are not our programming. You're more than your programming, but we can, if we're not conscious, in many of us, and where you don't have the training, you're not encouraged to have the mindfulness, the self-awareness, then basically you're not much more than the programming, because you know, that's what you've taken on. There's a whole dynamic I call thought viruses. And a thought virus would be a thought or a belief that's not mine. I didn't come up with it from my own personal experience, but you know, it's there just like a physical virus or a computer virus. It's there in the environment. And if you take it on, it can become you. I mean, it takes over the mechanism, but it isn't you. And you know, and if you, one of my latest books, I'm trying to actually help people to sort of develop what I might call a, you know, an internal virus detection program. So you can go, if you, as you listen to the political rhetoric, the divisiveness that's around in our world, how do you know, the conspiracy theories, et cetera? To me, there's all of these very typical red flags that come out. So, anyway, yeah, I'm definitely, I mean, I think, as I say, sort of my mission is, has always been wanting to create, bridges rather than barriers, wanting to create, something that's generative and innovative rather than that is restricting and homogenizing, so, and I think that all comes out of that era that we grew up in, which I am very grateful for.
Mhm. I think it was really an important time. For years and years, I would say out loud, I wish I had been alive during the 60s. And then I realized I was alive during most of the 60s,
You
but
were.
I was just born. Uh, oh, well.
But you know what, John, one of the things that we work with as well, and I think this might be very interesting and maybe also trigger something as part of our discussion. We say there's three intelligences. So one is the cognitive intelligence, which is what most people think of as intelligence. Then you've got a somatic intelligence, which we know that most creatures have somatic intelligence, especially mammals. They're not they're not thinking, verbalizing beings, but there's a somatic intelligence that's in the body. Then there's what we call a field intelligence, and the field intelligence is not within the individual. Actually, one of the things that Gregory Bateson said, he said that he used to say that the mind is immanent, meaning it emerges out of things. It's not separate from. It emerges from the interaction. And he said, but it's immanent, but not only in the body. He says it's immanent in pathways and messages outside of the body. He said, and the individual mind is a subsystem in a bigger mind that maybe it might be comparable to God, maybe what people call God, but it's still immanent in the whole social, interactive and social system. And the reason I bring that up is that the field of the 60s was there. And when your nervous system was forming, you may have been more influenced by the 60s than the people who were 20 years old in the 60s, because it was it's the water you were swimming in. And it was being co-created. So I mean, when I look at you, I was born in 1955, so I was somewhat, self-aware in the 60s. Definitely felt growing up. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was a contemporary of Steve Jobs. So I think there was very much this sense of we are here to make to make the biggest positive difference we can.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say you were in the 60s.
I was in the 60s. And I've been a part of a lot of different activism
Yeah.
and envisioning a future, for example, without police and prisons, where
Right.
when people harm each other, rather than harming that person, we really need better systems. And maybe also creating cultures where there's just less harm in
Yeah.
general to deal with. That would be really good. What you're saying about beliefs and judgment, self-judgment, and
Yes.
mindfulness, for me, meditation and then Buddhist psychology, which is can also be really complex, with simultaneous understandings of our relationship inside, outside with the world. There's a reality of my experience. There's a broader reality that's happening, and various combinations of all of that. How important, well, I just know for myself, sitting quietly and noticing my thoughts and practicing watching them and seeing what they are and how often they're happening without a judgment trying to squash them. I think that in neurolinguistic programming, it's really important in changing beliefs, not to try to squash them, push them away, but bring some mindfulness. How important is meditation or mindfulness to you?
You know, that is also another super rich and interesting question. So, a couple of things, John. Number one is one of the main forces at the beginning of NLP, or one of the main people that were modeled by Bandler and Grinder, was a man named Milton Erickson, who did hypnosis. But his form of hypnosis was not the, I'm controlling your brain hypnosis. It was much more mindfulness, was much more sitting, introspecting, paying attention. So one of the first things we all learned was self-hypnosis. And now my wife is a mindfulness meditation teacher. She studied with Jack Kornfield and sort of that whole sort of the more Buddhist influenced traditions. And she also, I met her because she was an interpreter. So she's just a little older than you. She was born in 1960 in San Jose, but she went to France as a young person and then ended up starting to do interpreting, and has interpreted most of the main consciousness teachers and spiritual teachers from English into French. One of the things that she said, she interpreted John Grinder and all these other people as well. So she said she believes that NLP is one of the greatest potential tools for mindfulness because it gives you things to be aware of. But so if you put together this notion of hypnosis, which is about, you're still, you're reflecting, you are getting outside of the cognitive mechanism, the tyranny of the conscious cognitive mind, if you will. But then if you have, in the self-witnessing point of view, you can then be aware of that. This is what allows you to begin to get some kind of, transcendence, some kind of separation. Then it becomes very interesting to go, well, so who am I without my thoughts? Who am I without those beliefs? What becomes possible if I'm able to, transcend that? I think this is where, I would say maybe another little thread here is one of the series of books that I wrote is called Strategies of Genius. We're looking at many well-known, starting with well-known geniuses like Walt Disney, but Mozart, Tesla, a number of other people. Einstein, I have a whole volume on Einstein. And one of the things that became really obvious is that all of these geniuses say essentially the same thing. The place where they had the genius, they just didn't say, I sat there and I figured it out. And they said, and like Mozart was very clear, he said, I cannot sit down and make the music. What I can do is I can put myself in a state where the music comes to me. And so it doesn't come from me, it comes through me. And Einstein said the same thing. He said, I did not come up with any of my theories by manipulations of mathematical axioms. He said, no productive thinker could, think in such a paper fashion. So one of the things that becomes clear is that these moments where something radically new comes is when we're in that place of silence, stillness, spaciousness. And then there's room for something more than the stuff that's already been, downloaded, if you will.
My name is John Malkin, and this is Transformation Highway on KZSC 88.1 FM, kzsc.org, broadcasting from the University of California, Santa Cruz. You've been listening to an interview with two instructors of NeuroLinguistic Programming, Michael Hall and Robert Dilts. They were in Santa Cruz in January 2024 with about 100 NLP trainers from 15 countries to attend a leadership summit. NLP was originally developed here at the University of California, Santa Cruz by Richard Bandler and UCSC professor John Grinder. Special thanks to Angela Bachfeld in Berlin for setting up these interviews.